Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we're going to conduct a broad analysis of the Cold War. Um, the uh, the uh, the last lecture introduced the demise of the Cold War and the setting of a new era of global power relations. That sharply contrasted the near half century uh, of intense emotions and an intense standoff between the Soviet Union on one hand and the United States on the other. And I'd just like to get sort of started right away with our recap, our look, our examination into the Cold War. Um, so World War II, we have seen, was followed by the very long conflict known as the Cold War. Some view it as the beginning before the war ended. It's often argued that the Cold War was an inevitable event in world history, that the differing ideologies of the Soviet Union and the United States put the two superpowers on a collision course. There is also a belief that the Roosevelt administration and that President Franklin Roosevelt in particular had been very naive. It's argued that if Roosevelt saw Stalin as a threat and refused many of the appeasements made to Stalin at the Yalta Conference, things would have gone in an opposite direction. And when we're really left when evaluating or when analyzing the Cold War, where we're left with really just a few questions: how and why the Cold War took place, and why it lasted so long. Um, and really to satisfy that, or to attempt to satisfy that, I'm just going to jump back to the 19th century, to United States-Russian relations in the 19th century. Now, when historians analyze the Cold War, we normally look where we normally look to, and we normally cite divergent and conflicting histories, ideologies, personalities, and interests between the United States and the Russians, between Americans and Russians, I should say, because it's the Republic in the 19th century and the Republic in the 20th century, two different nations with different attitudes altogether. The Russian Empire, Soviet Union, again, two different nations, two different attitudes. It is true that Russia and the United States had always possessed diametrically opposed political systems. Russia has a long tradition of centralized autocrats. First, we have the Romanov Tsars, figures like Nicholas I, Paul I, Alexander III, and of course Nicholas II. Alexander II is kind of an odd mixture of a liberalizing autocrat. Um, and then they had the communist leaders. In part, because of it's argued that in part of that equally long tradition of suffering invasions along her large borders, they needed that centralized leadership. Now, the United States had a long tradition of being fairly decentralized with a representational democracy, because of the nature of the settlement patterns that hinged on the rapid growth and expansion of self-contained and self-supporting communities that oversaw their own local affairs. The United States and the Soviet Union had been on friendly terms, the United States and Russia, I should say, had been on friendly terms throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. They weren't great powers by any means. Many people would like to think that the Russians were great powers, but the Russo-Japanese War proved otherwise. The lack of industrial capacity proved otherwise, and the really poor shape of the Russian army, particularly when facing the Prussian army, the bulk of the German Imperial Army stationed in the Prussian provinces and again stationed around Brandenburg, really just sort of offset any notion that Russia was a great power during during the 19th century. Um, sort of lost where I was in my notes. Give me a moment. They also shared a common enemy during the 19th century, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom checked the continental expansion of both aspiring powers. The United Kingdom checked the continental expansion of the United States of North America, with extending Canada all the way to the Pacific. The United Kingdom also checked the expansion of Russia into South Central Asia, Eurasia. By first taking up most of the Indian subcontinent, creating the British Raj, which includes the Republic of India now, the Republic of Pakistan, Bangladesh, all of these areas. And also making very, very strong overtures into the Persian Empire. We can look at large segments of the Persian Empire falling under the spheres of influence of both the United Kingdom and the Russian Empire. So they shared this mutual enemy in the United Kingdom. Both governments at the time operated under the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Both were seen as emerging powers, yet to tap into their full potential. There was also a view that the two would meet and contest each other as they both headed in the same direction with the same destination. Russia was going east and the United States was going west, and they would meet somewhere in the Pacific. Both William Stewart and Seward and Alexis de Tocqueville reached the conclusion that in the mid-19th century that the two would butt heads. This was very prophetic, but it wouldn't be in the 19th century. It would be in the 20th century where the two would butt heads in reality. Now, during the early 20th century, the interests of the two nations collided in Manchuria. Had alluded to in lectures on the Cold War, on the early stages of the Cold War, has alluded to during American imperialism. China was the great destination. The great marvel of the 20th century was that China survived and that China rebounded and became a strong power in her own right. China at the beginning of the 20th century had barely limped out of the 19th century and was poised to just be carved up by the great European powers. World War I, in many ways, saved China from becoming from facing a very undignified scramble for empire. Much the same way that during the 1880s there was a scramble for Africa. Without World War I, the 1910s, 1920s could very well have just seen a scramble for China. The two butted head at the end of the 19th century as the Tsar policy of Russification became more pronounced, and the United States became more vocal about her opposition towards the Russifications of European peoples, the forcing of European peoples to adopt more Russo attributes, speaking Russian language and practicing Russian Orthodoxy. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 brought the nations into a very deep ideological gulf. This new dispute with the new Russian government is claimed, the new Russian government claimed that the idea of communism, that the practice of communism, that communist governments will become the wave of the future, contradicting the Wilson administration's mission to spread American-style democracies across the world. The two nations, with their opposing universalistic ideologies, proposed to negate each other. Another source of tension between the new nations was the intervention in Russian affairs at the close of World War I by the United States and several other European powers in an attempt to support the White Russians and overthrow overthrow the Bolshevik government. Now, the United States also refused to recognize the communist government in Russia until 1933. Many historians also view the personality and the actions of Soviet leaders like Joseph Stalin, who crafted a career and a legacy as a bloody tyrant through the murder of all of his rivals and the ruthless coercion of his people through his domestic policies. Now, all of those, the American intervention in the into Russian affairs, the attempt to overthrow the Bolshevik government, the bloodiness and yet the ruthlessness of the policies of Joseph Stalin, and of course the diametrically opposed views did not stop the two powers from collaborating successfully to defeat the Axis powers, namely Germany, during World War II. The fact that they had succeeded in defeating Nazi Germany, their only shared enemy, brought them back to their old differences. It is also important to note that the Truman administration, and of course going back, we look at we see that Truman succeeds Roosevelt as president in 1945. That Truman did not command Stalin's respect the way Roosevelt did. And he also did not have the negotiating skills that Roosevelt did. Now, given these new realities, some post-war disagreements or spats should be expected. Now, the disagreements and the spats are not the same as the constant sphere. I want to note the disagreements and the spats that were to be expected were not the same as the constant fear of World War III during the 45 year standoff that was to come. As we've noted in past lectures, conflict between the two nations, between America and future allies or enemies, and then also just looking at what we said earlier in this lecture, the conflict between the United States and the Russians, between Americans and Russians, had existed since the late 19th century. And with only the late stage intervention of American troops into the Russian Civil War marked the only real hot war between the two in the long existence of the United States. Moreover, the hostilities between Tsarist Russia and the United States never led to a Cold War. This made the conditions. What really made the conditions ripe for a Cold War with the intense standoff and the fact that the world had changed and had changed fundamentally. The world wars had created an unprecedented global power vacuum. Not since the rise of organized sedentary states had all the regions of the world been without a dominant power. Germany, Italy, Japan, the Ottoman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Ethiopian Empire, France, the United Kingdom, or the Commonwealth, if you want to look at it globally, they had all either been totally destroyed, occupied, gravely weakened, or were descending into chaos as domestic rivals sought power. As domestic rivals sought to one-up each other. Every region in the world was basically powerless. Western Europe had no power. North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, South Africa, East Africa, no power. Near East had no power. Central Asia had no power. South Central Asia had no power. And of course, East Asia had no power. The only two peoples, two armies really left standing were the United States, who maintained a hegemonic type power over North America, North and South America, I should say, and the Soviet Union, which straddled Eastern Europe and Northern Eurasia, nearly the full run of Northern Eurasia. Not since we had organized states had there been power vacuums in so many regions that the globe was not able to support, to recognize all of these different powers, all of these different peoples. In the case of France and the United States, their loss of status had major global implications due to the massive colonial holdings, which were governed as extraction colonies and had no power to project locally. After the war, only the United States and the Soviet Union remained as first-class powers, and their power had been magnified by the lack of real rivals. They became the first global superpowers since France and Great Britain in the 18th century. In the aftermath of the victory over the Axis, both the United States and Soviet Union began to see the entire world had a zero-sum game. And a zero-sum game is, in order for me to advance, in order for me to increase from 5 to 6, you have to go from 5 to 4. In order for me to win and get 10, you have to lose all of your points and go down to 0. A zero-sum game. There can only be victory through someone else's defeat. And both of the superpower were now looking at the world and viewing it through the lens of the zero-sum game, in which victory can only mean defeat for the other side. Both powers began to view the other as an enemy through a prism shaped by preceding events that made the act of the other seem eerily similar to the actions of the Nazis. The lessons learned from World War II was to never appease and only negotiate from a position of strength. Moreover, each side viewed their actions as defensive, preconditioned by the abuses of the other power. Now, interestingly enough, the two powers were faced with a stalemate militarily. Because of the advent of nuclear weapons, in August of 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the respective military branches of the United States government, pointed out that neither the Soviet Union nor the United States could defeat each other in a conventional or a atomic nuclear war. They also pointed out that there will be a global shift in power unprecedented since the time of ancient Rome, and in their opinion, that there had been this global shift, that nuclear powers reinforced the military stalemate, that it was far from surprising, given all of these developments, that conflict between the two powers erupted. The first was the boundaries of Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe occupied by the Soviets. Both sides then accused the other of violating accords struck at Yalta. Occupied Germany became a hotspot, with tension flaring up on a near continual basis, with the Allied Council of Foreign Ministers failing to strike any agreements on either a final peace treaty or a final policy in Germany. The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki without first warning the Soviet Union only heightened Soviet suspicions of the designs the United States had for the Soviet Union and then also for the globe. Similarly, the discovery of Soviet spies in the atomic bomb project brought out new suspicions in the United States, and it led to a very vitriolic view of the Soviets in the United States. American fears were heightened by the activities of communist parties and the fears that Western Europe would sort of slip from fascism, from supporting the totalitarian leaders into supporting the communist bodies, the communist parties. These parties had gained prestige during the war because of their strident anti-Nazi activities. The United States fears grew even more as communist parties took power, and many of them were backed by the Soviet army, and they looked like they could really win elections in NATO states. They soon became obsessed with fears of a Soviet takeover of Western Europe. Now, the ideological defense, the ideological differences, I should say, came to a head first in February 1946, with speeches made by Stalin, in which he revived an old argument of conflict between the communist and the capitalist governments, and by the March speech by Winston Churchill. And then this was a speech he delivered at Bolton, Missouri, in which he first used the term "Iron Curtain" in describing the actions of the Soviets in Eastern Europe. The exact phrase was, "An iron curtain is descending upon Europe." When in 1947 the British indicated that they were no longer able to aid the Greeks against guerrilla insurgents or the Turks against Soviet actions, the United States took over in that role, with the promise to support free peoples who are resistant to armed minorities or hostile takeovers from foreign powers, which became a central theme of the Truman Doctrine. This action, those actions, led to those actions led to in March of 1947 a foreign ministry conference in Moscow. Now, the new Secretary of State, George Marshall, proposed a new European recovery program, the Marshall Plan, as it's called for rebuilding all of Europe, which Stalin feared, as he did not want Germany strengthened. Looking back at it, he could remember in his lifetime Germany, a strong Germany, being a dogged opponent who had defeated the Russians during World War I, and then he just looked back at the very hellacious dogfight that he had to fight against the Germans. Now he didn't want to go through that again. He wanted Germany weak, and he wanted lots of access points. He wanted buffer zones, protectorate buffer zones that could stall the Germans as Russia had to mobilize in the event of a future war. Strengthening Germany was the last thing on his mind. He didn't really care about any sort of economic benefits that the Soviet Union might gain. He simply did not want a strong Germany to contend with. Stalin was invited to join the recovery program, and he refused. He saw it as an effort to destroy the protective buffer states he created in Eastern Europe, to protect easy marching access into the Russian heartland. Stalin, it is said, forbade the states of Eastern Europe from joining the program either, and he clamped down on their autonomy, notably in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary. In 1948, the 10th anniversary of the Munich Agreement, both sides were keen to learn from their memories of the past, in a bid to forestall the building of NATO. Areas of Soviet Germany were blockaded, and the western entrances were blocked to the jointly administered city of Berlin. Berlin was in the heart of the Soviet zone, and this act led to the Berlin airlift that we spoke about earlier, and escalated the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the formation of a government in West Germany in 1949. NATO were proved to be the first peace alliance in United States history, and that's a surprising fact for a lot of people. A lot of people don't really know that NATO was the first alliance, peace alliance in American history. Most of the other alliances were alliances done in war. The alliance with France was done in war. Was a direct result of the Revolutionary War, the revolt, and the alliances during World War I and II were military alliances entered into during war. Now, the formation of NATO, the creation of a government for West Germany. These were all part of the United States' new foreign policy of communism containment. This policy was designed by George Kenning, who saw it has a policy that would lead to either a mellowing of Soviet expansion or a complete collapse of the Soviet Union. Containment led to a dramatic expansion of the United States' power as she sought to influence the nations surrounding the Soviet Union. Now, that plan of action negatively influenced the Soviet Union's perceptions of the United States. As the Soviets sought to counter what they viewed as aggressive actions by the United States. This mirroring brought the world to the brink of war, a world war almost immediately, had both sides were incapable of seeing where the other was coming from. And the war would have yet been disastrous because, as noted earlier, neither side was really capable of winning a war, fought against each other. And in reality, what happened in the immediate aftermath of these plans, of this new American foreign policy and the Soviet reaction to this American policy, was the division of Europe by the two superpowers into separate spheres of influence. And this new idea, this new determination that both powers will be willing to go to war to defend those spheres of influence. And we'll break here, and we'll come back with part 2 of our lecture, our analysis of the Cold War. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture.